Hi, fifth graders. Welcome back to Wit and Wisdom in Sync. I'm Ms. Foley, and I have a magnificent word for you today. Entomologist. Ology means the study of something, and ist is a person who's doing the study. So I wonder what ento is. Bugs, someone who studies insects. You try it. Entomologist. This is wordplay. You will need a few materials for today's lesson. You'll need your copy of the Phantom Toll Booth, handout 6A, setting and character analysis chart. You'll be needing to make a new one of those. Wit and Wisdom in
You can find your handout 6A in Schoology to export to Notability. It already has our character person that we're going to talk about today in the handout. So you just need to open it and export it to Schoology. And then you will also need your book.
Think about the places that Milo has visited and the characters he has met in the lands beyond. I just love saying that. What do the names of the places and the characters in the lands beyond have in common? Jot down your ideas in your journal. Did you think about the names of the places and the characters in the lands beyond, that they all involve wordplay? For example, the doldrums are gray and depressing and nothing ever happens there. And Talk is a watchdog whose body is an actual timepiece. So what does a deeper exploration of characters' traits reveal? Remember, a character's traits are the qualities that make up their personality. Think back to when you inferred some of the traits that Milo has from his words and his actions in Chapter 1. Do you also remember that in the lands beyond, the characters' traits relate to their names? And that's what helps us understand how Norton Juster is playing with the words and ideas. So as you read today, look for clues about the new characters to discover their traits and how they are yet more examples of wordplay. You will need your copy of the Phantom Toll Booth, so pause the video now if you need to retrieve it. Are you ready with your book? Great. When we left off reading Chapter 4 on page 47, Milo and Talk had ventured into the word market, which was filled with people, and they were hustling and bustling, and vendors were selling all kinds of different words. So let's jump back in here. Please turn to the top of page 47 to the second paragraph that starts with, Milo and Talk wandered up and down the aisles. Do you see it? I'm going to read the rest of Chapter 4, so listen and follow along with this purpose in mind. Pay attention to the new characters, big hint, that Milo and Talk meet, and jot down any details that you notice about them. Remember, the details that you notice about the characters are often going to be the clues about the puns in the characters' names. Are you ready? All right. Milo and Talk wandered up and down the aisles looking at the wonderful assortment of words for sale. There were short ones and easy ones for everyday use, and long and very important ones for special occasions, and even some marvelously fancy ones packed in individual gift boxes for use in royal decrees and pronouncements. Step right up, step right up. Fancy, best quality words right here, announced one man in a booming voice. Step right up. Oh, what can I do for you, little boy? How about a nice bag full of pronouns? Or maybe you'd like our special assortment of names. Milo had never thought much about words before, but these looked so good that he longed to have some. Look, Talk, he cried. Aren't they wonderful? They're fine if you have something to say, replied Talk in a tired voice, for he was much more interested in finding a bone than in shopping for new words. Maybe if I buy some, I can learn how to use them, said Milo eagerly as he began to pick through the words in the stall. and finally he chose three which looked particularly good to him: quagmire, flabbergast, and upholstery. He had no idea what they meant, but they looked very grand and elegant. "How much are these?" he inquired, and when the man whispered the answer, he quickly put them back on the shelf and started to walk on. "Why not take a few pounds of happies?" advised the salesman. "They're much more practical and very useful for happy birthday, happy new year, happy days, and happy-go-lucky." "I'd like to very much," began Milo, "but or perhaps you'd be interested in a package of goods, always handy for good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and goodbye," he suggested. Milo did want to buy something, but the only money he had was the coin that he needed to get back through the toll booth, and Talk, of course, had nothing but time. "No, thank you," replied Milo. "We were just looking." And they continued on through the market. As they turned down the last aisle of stalls, Milo noticed a wagon that seemed different from the rest. On its side was a small, neatly lettered sign that said, "Do it yourself." And inside were 26 bins filled with all of the letters of the alphabet from A to Z. "These are for people who like to make their own words," the man in charge informed him. "You can pick any assortment you like or buy a special box complete with all letters, punctuation marks, and a book of instructions. Here, taste an A. They're very good." Milo nibbled carefully at the letter and discovered that it was quite sweet and delicious, just the way you'd expect an A to taste. "I knew you'd like it," laughed the letter man, popping 2 G's and an R into his mouth and letting the juice drip down his chin. "A's are one of our most popular letters. All of them aren't that good," he confided in a low voice. "Take Z, for example. Very dry and sawdusty. And the X? Why, it tastes like a trunk full of stale air. That's why people hardly ever use them. But most of the others are quite tasty. Try some more." He gave Milo an I, which was icy and refreshing, and Talk a crisp, crunchy C. "Most people are just too lazy to make their own words," he continued, "but it's much more fun." "Is it difficult? I'm not much good at making words," admitted Milo, spitting the pits from a P. "Perhaps I can be of some assistance. ASSISTANCE, buzzed an unfamiliar voice, and when Milo looked up, he saw an enormous bee, at least twice his size, sitting on top of the wagon. "I am the spelling bee," announced the spelling bee. "Don't be alarmed. ALARMED." Talk ducked under the wagon, and Milo, who was not overly fond of normal-sized bees, began to back away slowly. "I can spell anything, ANYTHING, he boasted, or bragged. He was testing his wings. "Try me, try me." "Can you spell goodbye?" suggested Milo as he continued to back away. The bee gently lifted himself into the air and circled lazily over Milo's head. "Perhaps, PERHAPS, you are under the misapprehension," means misunderstanding, MISAPPREHENSION, "that I am dangerous," he said, turning a smart loop to the left. "Let me assure ASSURE that my intentions are peaceful." Intentions are plans. PEACEFUL. And with that, he settled back on top of the wagon and fanned himself with one wing. "Now," he panted, "think of the most difficult word you can and I'll spell it. Hurry up, hurry up!" And he jumped up and down impatiently. He looks friendly enough, thought Milo, not sure just how friendly a friendly bumblebee should be, and tried to think of a very difficult word. "Spell vegetable," he suggested, for it was one that always troubled him at school. "Oh, that's a difficult one," said the bee, winking at the letter man. "Let me see now. He frowned and wiped his brow and paced slowly back and forth on top of the wagon. "How much time do I have?" Just 10 seconds, cried Milo excitedly. Count them off, Talk. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, the bee repeated, continuing to pace nervously. Then, just as the time ran out, he spelled as fast as he could, Vegetable. Correct, shouted the letter man, and everyone cheered. Can you spell everything? Asked Milo admiringly. Just about, replied the bee with a hint of pride in his voice. You see, years ago I was just an ordinary bee, minding my own business, smelling flowers all day, and occasionally picking up part-time work in people's bonnets. Then, one day, I realized that I'd never amount to anything without an education. And, being naturally adept at spelling, I decided that balderdash, shouted a booming voice. Balderdash means nonsense. And from around the wagon stepped a large beetle-like insect, dressed in a lavish coat, striped pants, checked vest, spats, and a derby hat. Spats are his special kind of shoes, with black and white usually. Take a look. Let me repeat, balderdash, he shouted again, swinging his cane and clicking his heels in midair. Come now, don't be ill-mannered. Isn't someone going to introduce me to the little boy? This, said the bee with complete disdain, is the Humbug, a very dislikable fellow. Disdain means like, it's not even worth noticing. Nonsense! Everyone loves a humbug, shouted the Humbug. As I was saying to the king just the other day. You've never met the king, accused the bee angrily. Then, turning to Milo, he said, Don't believe a thing the old fraud says. Bosh, replied the Humbug. We're an old and noble family, honorable to the core, insecticus humbugium, if I may use the Latin. Why, we fought in the Crusades with Richard the Lionheart, crossed the Atlantic with Columbus, blazed trails with the pioneers, and today many members of the family hold prominent government positions throughout the world. History is full of humbugs. A very pretty speech, S-P-E-E-C-H, sneered the bee. Now why don't you go away? I was just advising the lad of the importance of proper spelling. Bah! Said the bug, putting an arm around Milo. As soon as you learn to spell one word, they ask you to spell another. You can never catch up, so why bother? Take my advice, my boy, and forget about it. As my great-great-great-grandfather George Washington Humbug used to say. You, sir, shouted the bee very excitedly, are an impostor. I-M-P-O-S-T-O-R, who can't even spell his own name. Impostor and fraud are both people who are not doing what they say they are doing, and they're trying to deceive someone. A slavish concern for the composition of words is the sign of a bankrupt intellect, roared the Humbug, waving his cane furiously. Milo didn't have any idea what this meant, but it seemed to infuriate the spelling bee, who flew down and knocked off the Humbug's hat with his wing. Be careful, shouted Milo as the bug swung his cane again, catching the bee on the foot and knocking over the box of W's. My foot, shouted the bee. My hat, shouted the bug, and the fight was on. The spelling bee buzzed dangerously in and out of the range of the Humbug's wildly swinging cane as they menaced and threatened each other, and the crowd stepped back out of danger. There must be some other way to, began Milo, and then he yelled, Watch out! But it was too late. There was a tremendous crash as the Humbug, in his great fury, tripped into one of the stalls, knocking it into another, then another, then another, then another, until every stall in the marketplace had been upset, and the words lay scrambled in great confusion all over the square. The bee, who had tangled himself in some bunting, toppled to the ground, knocking Milo over on top of him, and lay there shouting, Help! Help! There's a little boy on me! The bug sprawled untidily on a mound of squashed letters, and Talk, his alarm ringing persistently, was buried under a pile of words. So, how could we summarize this episode? Think about these questions. Who do Milo and Talk meet in this episode? And what happens between Milo, Talk, and the new characters that they meet? Pause the video and jot down your answers in your journal. Did you make a note that Milo and Talk meet two interesting new characters, the spelling bee and the humbug? The spelling bee and the humbug get into an argument and end up knocking over all the stalls in the marketplace, causing a great mess of jumbled up words. Here is the famous handout 6A. And just like the other characters and place names in the lands beyond, you can figure out how the spelling bee and the humbug are examples of wordplay by studying the descriptions and the illustrations of these new characters. We are going to analyze the spelling bee's character together, and then you'll analyze the humbug on your own. Okay, so we're going to need handout 6A, Setting in Character Analysis Chart. This is my original one that I like to keep because it's got these great questions on it that help me answer or at least guide my thinking here for what I can put in these boxes. But I made a simple, plain one that just has the boxes on it basically so that I have more room to write. And you can certainly do that too. This one is for the spelling bee, and I also labeled it handout 6A so I can always remember that as well. So I want to be looking for some evidence that helps me understand the personality and the traits of the spelling bee so that I can figure out, especially when I get down to here, the wordplay that Norton Juster is using. So let's take a peek in the text and see what there is. I'm first going to look for a description of the spelling bee. So here I have something I noticed down here. I can spell anything, and then of course he spells it A-N-Y-T-H-I-N-G. He boasted, or he bragged, testing his wings. Try me, try me. And then what we realize is that he's enormous, right? Like he's twice Milo's size. So the description is that he is a giant bee, right? But we also know who spells words is what he does. And let's see else. When I found that part about I can spell anything, he boasted. He boasts and brags a little bit, but I think it's because he's proud. He's actually very proud that he is a spelling bee. He's proud of his ability to spell words, and he brags, I'm going to use that word, that he can spell. And he is a good speller. He brags that he can spell anything. A-N-Y-T-H-I-N-G. Yep. Let's see. I also remember, let me see in the book. On page 52, there was a part where, do you remember he said, I'll layer this over here. He told Milo that he used to be an ordinary bee, but then he realized that he would never amount to anything without an education. Do you remember when he said that? And I'm going to put that in quotes because that's actually the author's words from the text. Never amount. So that part is directly from the text. He realized that he would never amount to anything without an education, which tells me that he values, being smart and being educated. All right, so there are a couple of ideas for the description. What about the illustration? What did you notice when you looked at that illustration of the bee? One thing I noticed is the bee is very large compared to Milo, which is quite unusual, right? I also noticed that probably because he's so huge, Milo looks nervous and anxious, right? He looks a little bit tense, and he's probably never seen such a large bee. Not just a bee, but any kind of insect. That thing, I think it described him as being twice as big as Milo. The other thing, because of the size of the bee, and he's kind of, hovering over, Milo might assume that the bee is dangerous. So Milo might assume that the bee is dangerous. Well, wouldn't you? He's enormous. So we know that a bee is a flying insect, and we know what it means to spell. But have you ever heard of the term spelling bee? Now that you've studied the spelling bee's character, what do you think or know a spelling bee is? So I'm going to let you do this work too, because we're thinking about what we think it means based on what we've experienced in the text. So write on your paper right now what you think a spelling bee is. And don't worry if you're not sure, just make an educated guess based on the clues from the spelling bee's character. So the actual definition of a spelling bee, and some of you may have even participated in one of these, is a spelling bee is a spelling competition in which any contestant who misspells a word is eliminated. So each person one at a time comes up to perhaps a microphone or a podium. Somebody gives them a word and they have to spell it, kind of like the way that the spelling bee does. And if they miss it, they're out. Given that we know that a spelling bee is a competition in which any contestant who misspells a word is eliminated, that's a real thing. How is the spelling bee's name yet another example of wordplay? Well, I think that the name spelling bee is a play on words because he's literally a bee who can spell, right? He can spell correctly. But more than that, oops, maybe I should lift this up so you can see it. So the name spelling bee is a play on words because he is literally a bee who spells words correctly. And a spelling bee is also a contest in which people compete against each other to correctly spell words. And it seems like our spelling bee from the Phantom Toll booth would love to participate in a spelling bee. Whew. Why don't you take a break and buzz around for a minute or two? You've been busy bees. Pause the video to take a moment to stretch or take a quick break. And when you're done, unpause the video and join me back here. In this chapter, Milo and Talk also meet another interesting character, the Humbug. Humbug. Now it's your turn to study the description and the illustration of this character more closely to determine the meaning of the word humbug and how he, too, represents a play on words. So open to a clean page in your journals, pause the video, and because you're now experts on this chart, recreate this chart for the humbug. So for this check for understanding, you're going to describe the humbug using the text and the illustrations. Complete the description and the illustration rows using the questions on handout 6A. Remember to go back to 6A and read the questions that are in each box to help guide your thinking. And then remember also you can refer back to pages 53 to 57 in the text. For right now, just focus on the description and the illustration rows. We'll get to the rest in a while. Pause the video and complete this task now.